afternoon, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. It's such a privilege being here. I'd like to start by thanking the organizers. It's such a privilege being at the World Social Forum and having the opportunity to share with you some information, some basic information, and possibly some thoughts about my country of birth, Egypt. My presentation is more or less going to be an introduction and a segue into the main speaker of the day, Peggy Mason, who's going to be with us shortly. I'll briefly go over the Egyptian bloc, the organizations that put this event together. I'll go over the timeline just to bring everybody up to speed. From the time the world was mesmerized by the Egyptians who took to Tahrir Square till today. We'll talk about the current situation, the human rights situation in Egypt. We'll talk about the economy in Egypt. And then we'll talk about Canada's reaction to the revolution and the coup that came after. And then I'll hand it over to Peggy, who will talk in depth about some more important and serious issues. So to start with, this event has been put together by 3 organizations, and we're lucky to have a local, a national, and an international organization. The local organization being the Egyptian Canadian Home Organization, the national being the Egyptian Canadian Coalition of Democracy, and the international organization is the Egyptian Revolutionary Council. Together they make what we termed the Egyptian Bloc for Democracy. I'm not going to go into details and read everything. This is in front of you to read very quickly. And if we need any more information about those organizations, I can direct you to the website after the presentation. So the Egyptian bloc, or the 3 organizations, stand for certain principles. Most of them were formed after the coup that took place and hijacked the Egyptian revolution of January 25th. So the most important thing is they reject the military intervention in political life and everything that comes with it. Those are the principles that the bloc stands for. And those are the objectives. We want to keep alive the principles of the Egyptian revolution of January 25th, 2011. We support the democratic aspirations of Egyptians. We wanted to inform the public about the current situation in Egypt, and that's why we're here. We demand that our Canadian government refrain from doing business as usual with Egypt, which is what's happening right now. Just to give you a bit of an idea about what happened in Egypt since the Egyptians took to Tahrir Square, and the whole world watched as they peacefully demonstrated against the dictatorship of Mubarak. So this would provide a quick timeline of what happens. So in January 25th, many Egyptians went to the street. Actually, a majority of young people in Egypt went to the streets, rejecting the dictatorship of Mubarak. By the 28th, most of the Egyptians were actually in the streets demonstrating. On February 22nd, the government forces and thugs attacked the protesters. On February 11th, 18 days after the revolution started, Mubarak resigned. In March 19th, 2011, there was a referendum on the roadmap. Which one comes first, the election or the presidential election or the parliament? It was a fair referendum. In October 9th, 2011, the military forces committed the Maspero massacre. In November 23rd, the military forces committed the Mohammed Mahmoud massacre. In January 23rd, 2012, President Morsi was elected president. It was the first fair and democratic election in the history of Egypt for the last 60 years, or as far as we remember. In February 22nd, there was the upper house election. Again, it was a fair election, and after 2 rounds, Mohamed Morsi was sworn in as Egypt's first democratically elected president. He won the vote by 51.7%. The constitutional referendum took place on December the 22nd. There was 34% participation and 63% approval. In June 30th, 2013, what has been termed the counter-revolution took place, where people were mobilized and rallied against the reign of Mohamed Morsi. At the same time, a lot of people took to the streets in support of Mohamed Morsi, and they occupied what has become known as the Rabaa Square, the symbol of resilience. The military coup took place on July the 3rd, as some of you may be aware, and the military committed some of the most heinous massacres in the history of Egypt, possibly in the history of mankind. I did not prepare the presentation, so I'm just going through it very quickly. Some people take credit for this part of the presentation. In June 4th, 2014, after giving assurances that he will not be seeking presidency, General Abdel Fattah Sisi, the coup leader, was declared the president of Egypt with 96% of the votes in a stage election. There was less than 12% participation, if that. Now, the part that I want to talk about is where are we after 3 years? The military has taken over, has taken hold of the country. Democracy has been squashed. Egyptians are divided. They've never been that divided, but the Egyptians are actually divided within the same family. You'll find people that were still supporting President Morsi and the democratic process, while you would find some members of the family supporting General Fattah Sisi and the military overlord. Human rights were violated. We'll talk about this in a little bit more details. So where is Egypt right now in terms of human rights? I'm going to take a page off Human Rights Watch World Report. When they talk about human rights, they talk about a number of things. One of them is the armed groups in counterterrorism. One of the reasons the military took over is, according to them, is to provide stability in the country. That never happened. Egyptian government said that its counterterrorism operations of North Sinai killed at least over 3,000 terrorists between January and July. Within 6 months in 2015, they killed at least 3,000 terrorists. That does not spell stability. Sorry if the typo here. Between October 2014 and August 2015, the armed force demolished more than 27 buildings and evicted thousands of families on the border with the Gaza Strip, violating human rights law and possibly the laws of war. The government claimed that it was to create a buffer zone in Gaza. Sisi also issued a law authorizing a US $6,400 fine and possible 1-year work ban for anyone who publishes news regarding terrorism that contradicts the Defense Ministry's official statement. So this is really what happened to human rights after the military took over. Just some examples of the armed forces abuses. On July 1st, a special police unit acting on information from the Interior Minister's National Security Agency raided an apartment in Cairo suburb and killed 9 Brotherhood officials. This was new in Egypt. To have such assassinations, targeted assassinations, was a new thing and a new tactic that the military started using. National security officers were responsible for dozens of enforced disappearances, and this continues till today, often targeting political activists. The National Security Agency banned scores of Egyptians, including activists, politicians, and academics, from traveling. Police regularly use torture in their investigation. That's well documented by Human Rights Watch as well as Amnesty International. Those are just some examples of the armed forces abuses. If you want to talk about due process violations and mass death sentences, since Morsi's removal, courts have handed down at least 547 initial death sentences in cases connected to political violence, most involving Brotherhood members, but it was not limited to Brotherhood members. Mass trials also involved those not belonging to the Brotherhood. In February, a judge sentenced activist Ahmed Douma, women's rights defender Hind Nafeye, and 228 others to life in prison for participating in a December 2011 protest. So there are a number of issues that the Human Rights Watch report documented, and it was a damning report for the Egyptian military and the coup leaders in Egypt. This is in a nutshell what happened in Egypt. If you want to know what happened in Egypt in a nutshell, President Abdel Fattah Sisi, who took office in June 2014, leads a country at this point that remains in a human rights crisis. And those are not my words, those are the words of Human Rights Watch. Authorities have effectively banned protests, imprisoned tens of thousands, often after unfair trials, and outlawed the country's largest opposition group, the Muslim Brotherhood. Sweeping counterterrorism law has expanded the authorities' power. National security officers commit torture and enforce disappearances. And many detainees have died in custody from mistreatment. The government continues to investigate independent NGOs and put journalists on trial. That's in a nutshell what the situation is when it comes to human rights abuses in Egypt. This is important for us to keep in the back of our mind, because when we come to talk about, I'll talk about this briefly, but Peggy will probably touch on it as well in more details. When we talk about Canada and Canada's role in upholding our principles and values in dealing with countries and regimes that commit such atrocities and violate human rights, this will be important as a backdrop. Egypt's economy. On my way here, I was actually chatting with my companion, and we were talking about Egypt and the economy in Egypt. And one of the things that a lot of people don't understand is nearly half of the Egyptian people subsist on less than $2 a day. And many people would think, well, maybe $2 here is not enough to buy an extra large double-double. It's $2.10 at Tim Hortons, if you use Tim Hortons. Starbucks is a lot more expensive. So it's not enough to buy a cup of coffee in Canada, but maybe in Egypt it is sufficient and it is enough for a family of 4 or 5, the average Egyptian family, to have 3 meals and pay for their utilities and the shelter over their head. The truth is, it is not. When I was in Egypt a few years ago, I frequented some coffee shops, and they're everywhere, specialty coffee shops, similar to Starbucks, but from different countries. And you pay exactly the same amount that you would pay here. A cappuccino would not be less than $5 US. If you go to fast food joints, McDonald's, Dairy Queen, you're paying exactly the same amount that you would pay here. Now granted, the average Egyptians consider that as a novelty, and most of them would not eat in such places. But $2 a day, for those who are not aware, is not even enough to buy you half a pound of meat a day, let alone allow a whole family to live on. So it is very important for us to keep that in mind. And you know, the economy is still one of the most important issues, even in Canada. In a country like Canada, where the basic necessities are met, the economy is still the #1 election issue, and it was in the last election. In developing countries where people can hardly get by, when they don't have enough food to feed their children, the economy definitely becomes a criteria by which you evaluate a government. And based on that evaluation, you would deal with that regime if it's able to provide. So the economy in Egypt, in a snapshot, has suffered from a number of things. One is declining tourism. After the coup regime took over, the national Egyptian TV had as a backdrop the wording fighting terrorism or counter-terrorism. The idea was they wanted to win the hearts and minds of the Western audience by saying that we're with you in the same trenches. We're fighting terrorism, and that's why we're doing what we're doing and committing the abuses that we have to commit. That doesn't spell very well. It doesn't say too much about the stability in the country, and definitely does not encourage people to visit a country that relies heavily on tourism. The Suez Canal revenue has declined considerably, and I'm not comparing it to the time before the revolution, but even comparing it to the time of Morsi. Even with the new project that they celebrated and got the whole world to celebrate with them, the Suez Canal revenues have declined considerably during the time of a Sisi government. The persistent Islamist insurgency led by ISIS, there is no doubt that that ISIS now has a very strong hold in the Sinai Peninsula and has supporters all over the country. And more so than it has ever been at any time in history. So the idea that we're investing so much money and so much revenue on the military to combat terrorism did not yield the outcome that we were told it would. Foreign revenues dwindling to dangerous levels, or foreign reserves dwindling to dangerous levels. It is natural that this would happen in a country that has become as unstable as Egypt. Now, some people may say, well, Egypt has always suffered from economic challenges. This is not new. There's nothing new about this. But the situation in the last 2 years has considerably deteriorated. Right now, we're looking at 9% annual inflation rate. We're looking at 13% unemployment. So we're not qualifying employment at this point. We're just saying 13% unemployment. The annual budget deficit is about 12%. And as I said, if those numbers don't mean a lot to you, nearly half of the Egyptian people subsist on less than $2 a day. So where is the revenue going? We know that the Gulf countries have subsidized Egypt in the last few years. Many countries have provided aid, including our beloved country, Canada, unconditional aid. So where is all that revenue going? So 80% of the annual government spending is between those three items: food and energy subsidies. Salaries of 7 million employees and the state's bloated bureaucracy. A country of 90 million people have 7 million people as government employees. And of course, the debt servicing. What is really the underlying problem in Egypt in Egypt economy? The underlying problem is very straightforward. It's the military's oversized role in the financial system. The army controls an estimated 30% of the economy, and I think that's a very, very modest estimate. A friend of mine just sent me a picture of a letter that was sent to all the deans of universities, and specifically to those of the faculties of medicine. And the letter says, or demands, that the deans cancel all contracts for all medical supplies, for all pharmaceuticals, and submit the requests to the military. And I'm told by reliable sources that this is not only going to be for university hospitals, but it will actually apply to every hospital in the country. And this is a trend that we see in every sector, in every industry, that the military is starting to control all the supplies, and the idea is it's the economy of scale. And that's how they sell it. We're able to secure better contracts, but in that, obviously, they're killing all the competition that you would want when it comes to such huge contracts. So that is the core problem. Okay, so Canada and Egypt. Now, you would think, having seen the report from Human Rights Watch organization, and Amnesty International, you would think that Canada will be up in arms, demanding that Egypt return back to the path of democracy and refrain from violating human rights. You and I would have hoped that this would be the case, knowing the values and the ideals and the principles that we hold very dearly. But Canada basically went from defenders of democracy to enablers of military junta, and the term here is borrowed from Haroon Siddiqui. Canada has certainly become one of the countries that are considered enablers of the military junta. Canada was actually, and this is interesting, and hopefully we'll have time to talk about this in a little bit more details, because I think Western countries have learned the lesson. Canada was one of the first Western nations to call the coup what it is, a coup. So we declared it a coup right after it happened. We were very quick. We declared it a coup. The media called it a coup, and the politicians called it a coup. Then we did an about-face 180 degrees, and we changed our mind, and we changed the language, and we have a media expert that if you have any questions, you can direct to later on. And we will see certain things. I'm going to go into that. So we start with the Conservative government, because that was the government at the time. Stephen Harper was very quiet about what happened in Egypt, and as if it didn't concern him, and it's not something that is happening on the world stage that he needed to comment on. Questions were asked about Tariq Labani and John Grissom who were detained in Egypt. There were no answers. There was no intervention on the part of the government. Every other government intervened to release their nationals from the hands of the Sisi armed forces, except Canada. Mohamed Fahmy, and I'm sure most of you have heard the story. It was in the news for such a long time, and all he needed was a phone call from Harper to General Sisi, and he asked for it, but that phone call never took place. In fact, Harper never acknowledged, never commented on such issues. Lastly, Khaled Kazaz are still in Egypt at this point with his Canadian wife and Canadian kids, unable to return to Canada. So that was the position of the head of the government, Stephen Harper. It was as if he was confused, didn't know how to answer or didn't know what was going on. But Harper always left the heavy lifting to a person that we know. Just before we go into this, Harper is not always confused, because in Ukraine, Canada took actually the toughest stance against the Russians annexing Crimea. And Harper even told Putin to his face that Crimea has to be returned. So we're not always confused about what happens in the world around us, and we don't have a problem taking a stance on certain issues. As a matter of fact, the Americans were criticized human rights violations in Egypt. Canada didn't. Never. Canada actually spoke about the human rights violations in Egypt in an open way. And we will talk about this a little bit later. But Harper always left the heavy lifting to someone else, someone that we're very familiar with, who's no longer in politics, Joan Baird. Joan Baird did most of the heavy lifting when it comes to foreign affairs for Harper. And the Egyptian-Canadian Coalition for Democracy attempted many, many times to meet with Joan Baird. And obviously were always declined. And we came to know that it's not that he does not meet with people like us, he does not meet with anyone. Joan Baird actually visited Egypt twice in a very, very short time. And this is a picture of Joan Baird tweeting his picture after meeting with Abdel Fattah Sisi in Davos. Those are just some of the things that Joan Baird has done, switching Canada's position from a defender of democracy to an enabler of the military rule. So Joan Baird somehow found that Egypt is now transitioning to democracy, and it's inclusive of human rights and the rule of law. I don't know what he based that on, because all the reports that were coming out of Egypt were definitely telling him that this is not the case. Not only that, and this is what we get a lot of the times, there's not much we can do, and we use quite diplomacy to advance the cause of human rights. But Canada does have things to do. Canada actually provides aid, and Joan Baird announced a $2 million funding to Egypt, and again, it's unconditional. Finally, last nail in the coffin, Joan Baird said that he's quite pleased with the significant leadership that the new government of Egypt is taking first in confronting the terrorist acts of the Muslim Brotherhood. This was basically Joan Baird endorsing the regime's attack on all political opponents, which are now considered anyone that is becoming a voice for dissidents is now labeled as a Muslim Brotherhood supporter. Now, so this was the conservative government. Was the liberal government any better? We hope so. During the election, we really had high hopes that the liberal government will take a different stance. Egyptian Canadians were actually very shocked when all of a sudden, without any announcement, we heard that the defense minister is in Egypt. This you could hardly find it in the Canadian media, but it was in the Egyptian media, plastered in all news outlets, publications. And then this is one of the things, so that we have to realize that the Egyptian government, or the coup government, uses such things for their own propaganda. So this happened in December 19th, 2015. Then the most important visit came from Stéphane Dion recently. Again, unconditional support, words of encouragement about Egypt and its return to the path of democracy. Those are just some pictures from Stéphane Dion's visit with Sisi, him, and his assistant Omar Labra. Now, we've also actually attempted to meet with Stéphane Dion. We asked him for a meeting several times. Obviously, our request was always declined. And basically, talking to some of his assistants, the message that we got is, you need to grow up. Politics are not done that way. We do advance the cause of human rights in the back rooms and with quite diplomacy. But we're more interested and concerned about the economic interests of Canada, and being able to secure such contracts as that of Bombardier is more important to Canadians. That's basically the words that we're hearing right now. But the idea is you got to grow up. And what you hear a lot, and you heard that from the Conservative government as well as the Liberal government, is, apologize about that, is we're much better having a seat at the table than not being engaged. And we're trying to help the people of Egypt by providing aid and providing support. We're helping the people that you want us to help. And not having a seat at the table would just eliminate our ability to reach out to the Egyptian government or the Egyptian officials or the Egyptian people and organizations and advance the human rights issue. Now, we may agree or disagree on that issue, but we have not heard a voice from the Canadian government talking about human rights violations in Egypt. So if we disagree on the fact whether you should boycott and disengage or engage with the government of Egypt, I don't think we disagree about if you do engage, you have to be a voice of human rights and the rule of law and the return to the path of democracy. That has not happened. This is our cute Prime Minister. Those are some of his comments to his colleagues. I was in Tunisia and Egypt this week, as if they didn't know. Two countries that are still functional. hopefully for long. We don't know for how long, but he considers it to be still functional, trying to become democracies. And I don't know when Canadians started believing that democracy can actually come to any country on the back of tanks. That is new in the history of Canada. So they're trying to become democracy under the military rule, struggling to progress, but the environment is awfully difficult. It's not that the ruling regime does not have any intention of returning to democracy, it's just the environment around them is awfully difficult. And then he tells them that if we don't support these countries, then we lose the opportunity to have prevention, and when the collapse will happen, it will be much more complicated for us to figure out what to do. Apart from his convoluted language, basically what it's telling them, again, is we need to support those countries in whatever way possible without any mention of the conditions that should be attached to that kind of support. So where are we in terms of Canada and its position with Egypt? We have basically betrayed our Canadian values, and I said I'm going to leave that to Peggy to elaborate on. Canadian economic interest is the first thing that Canadian officials are thinking about, without any interest in human rights or the return to the path of democracy. And really, I have to stop here and question the wisdom behind our government and the way they're dealing with the issue. And if this is good for Canadian, one may understand it, but it's not. The fact is, it does not serve. I don't know why the Canadian government and the foreign minister think that aligning themselves with the coup leaders and the military serves the interest of Canada and Canadians. The economy is deteriorating rapidly. Terrorism is on the rise. The region is becoming very unstable. It is unlikely that this government will continue for any length of time. It's certain that this government will fall at some point, and no one knows what kind of instability would take place at that point. Plus, what happened to our ideals and making sure that democracy returns to Egypt, and that people are voted into office through a ballot box, not on the backs of tanks. It's not in anybody's interest. It's not in the interest of Canada or Canadians. It's definitely not in the interest of Egypt. Now it's interesting, and I'm not going to really elaborate on it too much, but as I said, it seems like the Western governments, Canada included, have learned their lesson from very quickly supporting democracy, which is what we're trained and raised to do. So what happened in Egypt when the military first took over and ousted President Morsi? Canada was the first country, one of the first countries to declare a coup. When it came to Turkey, everybody was very cautious. And most countries are actually accused now of hoping that the coup would have succeeded, and they would have celebrated and would have found a way to live with the coup, if not support it. So it's interesting that they held all their press releases. There was nothing that was issued by the Canadian government. And very much later, after the coup has failed, they started saying that we support democracy in Turkey, but then very quickly jumped into criticizing the government for what is now being termed the purge. So it's interesting to compare the two. So what do we want from our government? Again, Peggy would probably speak about that a little more than I would. But really, I'm going to limit it to one thing, which is to uphold our ideals, our principles, and our values, and uphold them publicly. We're not a country that should be content. We're not people that should be content with statements such as, we are advancing the cause of human rights in the back rooms or with quiet diplomacy. We are a nation that is known to speak out, and we have seen circumstances and situations in Iran and Ukraine and other places, so this is not unique to us. So our ask of the Canadian government is very, very simple. Uphold what Canadians hold dear and do that publicly, because that's what we expect from you. I'm going to end up with basically those are some of the things that we need them. We need them to be transparent. We need to see some accountability. We need them to intervene when Canadians are detained in foreign countries, and we need them to promote democracy, not violations of human rights.